Hello and welcome. I'm glad you could be with me. We've got a very important and interesting show tonight. We're going to be talking about brain injuries and about the Minnesota Brain Injury Alliance. With me to talk about a family injury are the Johnsons. Ric Johnson sustained a really serious brain injury, and he's here to share that story with us, that hard story. And his wife Beth is here to talk some about the family's experience. I learned as I was getting ready for this show how common brain injuries are. I had not realized that they were as common as they are. If you take all the breast cancer cases, all the HIV/AIDS cases, and all the MS cases, multiply that total by 6, you'll have the number of brain injury cases we have in our country. And that's a lot of people dealing with this. In Minnesota alone, we have 100,000 people dealing with a brain injury. So a lot to learn, I think, for all of us about this. Well, first of all, welcome you two.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Ric, I want to go back to 2003 when you had an accident, and have you recounted? I'm sure it's not something you like to talk about, but.
Sure. In October 18th, 2003, I was cleaning the gutters on my house.
A real Minnesota tradition in the fall.
I've been doing that for years and years.
Sure.
I missed a step on the ladder, and down I went, and I hit my head on the concrete slab on the driveway.
So kind of head first, Ric?
Head first, right down. My daughter saw it happen and called 911 because I was unconscious instead of standing up and yelling at the ladder. So I was admitted into HCMC that day. My family would show up, and they were just told he's in critical condition. We don't know exactly how bad it is yet. So I was in a gurney in a bed, and my family just hanging around, seeing what's going to happen to me.
Must have been terrifying for you, Beth, at that point.
It was, because they really can't give you any information. I really think they don't know enough about brains to know what's going to happen.
I'm thinking
and everyone is
maybe
different.
The diagnostic part of it is harder than we might know to figure out.
Yeah.
So.
And then about 3 days later, they needed to give me surgery to remove a bone from my skull to get the swelling down. My wife was called from the HCMC to say he's in surgery right now to do this. So my wife and daughter and son ran over, or drove over, to see how I am. And when they saw me in my bed after the surgery, there was a big sign that says no bone, to let people know, be careful of this guy. It doesn't have a skull anymore, the full skull. We call it my ditch, but that's
sort of an
thing.
indention that you can feel yet.
And I had trach and a mentally induced coma, all the tubes and things that a person could have in a hospital, to see how I'm going to do after the surgery.
How long was the medically induced coma, Ric?
Well, 2 to 3 weeks, I guess. After a few days, they start looking to see if you're waking up. And I guess there's a time limit not a time limit, but they have a time span that they look for. After 3 days, you'd be doing this. After 4 days, you'd be doing that.
Should be doing,
They have, I don't remember the scale they call it now, but the coma scale,
Yeah.
but I was number 3, and that means we have no idea if this guy is going to go through it
Gonna
this or
make
not.
it. Huh?
Yeah.
What were some of the? Could you speak when you came out of the coma? What were some of the early losses that you had to deal with?
No, I couldn't talk. I'll go to get into that, but I mean, I could follow motion, and if somebody was talking to me, I could look to see who was talking to me. So I have I knew what was going on.
Could you understand what people were saying?
No,
I
not
don't-
really.
No.
I knew there was something going on. And
You
that's all.
recognized Beth, though, and the kids?
Yep, I think so. I hope
Yeah,
so.
I think he did. We had pictures up and we'd say, who is this? And finally he started getting kind of mad at us, like, why are you asking me these dumb questions?
To me, it was dumb questions, but not to them. And so that was probably a month.
In the hospital?
At HCMC.
At HCMC.
Oh, okay.
And then the second month, I was transferred to Bethesda. And that was kind of
To remove your
to remove
trach.
the trach and the feeding tubes, because doing cognitive therapy, so they can figure out if I could remember what happened. If the normal stuff that you were able to do when you were growing up, and before you went to grade school, you can tie your shoes, swallow, eat, all of those kind of things.
Sure.
At cognitive therapy, they have to see, do you remember those kind of things?
Even how to swallow when you're drinking
Yeah.
water or
So
eating
you
your
go
food.
way back to almost like an infant
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
terms of functioning.
And that's when
so-
they knew I couldn't talk. I sounded like the Swedish chef. It was my
And the
language.
Muppets.
Nobody could understand me, and I couldn't really understand the others.
So very isolating
Yeah.
and very, for you, frightening, I'm sure.
Yeah, that was frightening. But I just kind of always knew he'd be okay.
Did you really? That is interesting and wonderful sense
Yeah.
of security, perhaps. And that must have helped in a way get through this hard time. For you, Beth, what's been the hardest aspect of having your spouse go through such an ordeal and change all the, I'm guessing the family dynamics had to change in those years way
Yeah,
back?
our son was away at college, so,
Oh.
and that was a good thing. We decided, let's keep him there. And
Let his
And-
life be more normal?
yeah, and my daughter was 13, which is kind of an interesting age
Very
anyway.
interesting,
Yeah.
yes.
So I think to me the hardest thing was how it affected her and how hard it was for her.
And
But-
did she express her fears to you? Was she able to talk about it?
Yeah, she did.
Because some kids
Yeah.
wouldn't and would just hold it inside. But that was important, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
it was real good, and she could talk about it, and she's always been real close to Rick, so I think it was very hard.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, Rick, now you are functioning at a high level again, but how long did you feel, and you just gave me kind of a look
Yeah,
there that,
yeah.
that I'm guessing means, well, maybe
Yeah.
not as high as you think, Mary?
Yeah.
Is that
yeah,
what that look
yeah,
meant?
Yeah. After my third month, it was a different hospital, doing more therapy to figure out what I needed. And then in January 2004, I was sent home, released from the hospitals. And I went to Kurds Center for speech and occupational therapy. And the speech was the key. And I remember I would go to the therapy session, come back home, take a nap because it just wears you out. And then Beth and Abby, my daughter, would play games with me. You know, what week is this? Can you say the days? Ascending, descending orders. What year is this? Or I would say something like, you know, during the therapy, they were showing me a picture and I couldn't figure out what that was. So I kind of draw a picture and say, what is that? And they would say, well, probably that. And I would say, that was the word. So it's called aphasia.
Where you can't think of
you just can't find
the word
the
you want.
Yeah, just can't find it. Your brain is trying to tell you what the word is, but your mouth can't find it.
So
can't
you
say
know in
You
your
know
mind
it.
what you want to say, but it's not coming up.
It just can't come.
And that's
Yeah.
a common stroke kind of
Yep.
result too, isn't it?
Yep.
But that came back gradually then?
Well, I was in speech therapy for almost a year at Curd Center. Just trying to figure out what the language means and trying to figure out what word is that. My family would look at me and it's like, oh, he's trying to find that word. Let's not tell him.
Yeah, we
You
didn't
can't
tell
tell 'em.
him.
You're
It
not
was kind of
supposed
mean,
to.
but
But that's probably what you were told to do, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't provide it.
Yeah.
Did the speech, it sounded from what you just said a minute ago, Rick, that the speech preceded the other things you worked on in terms of mobility issues, balance. Did those things get affected?
I have a balance problem still.
Okay.
There's things that I need to go up a couple steps on the ladder. I don't do ladders anymore.
Good, good. Glad to hear that.
Changing the clock for daylight saving time or another thing. There's a clock in our house. You need to stand on this chair to get it.
Right.
I say, Beth, there's the chair. Or
good.
there's a clock. I'll hold the chair for you, but I'm not going in there.
So you know some of your limits that
Yeah.
you listen to. That's
Yep.
important,
Yep.
I bet. I bet not everyone would do that.
Well, sometimes you just have to do it. Like
Can't be macho
painting
man.
the house, painting the living room or something like that. Well, I can do 1 or 2 steps on the step ladder, but I'm not going to do the 3rd step or the 4th step, something like that.
or when he walks downstairs, he always watches his feet.
Oh, yeah.
That
I
sounds good
grab
too.
the railings.
I'm getting a signal that we only have about half a minute left.
Oh.
This has gone so fast. I want just in this last half minute to ask you, what advice, if you think of that word in a general way, would you give another family who may just, recently have had someone in the family have a serious brain injury? What would you say to them to kind of give them
Well,
some info that would be important?
I would say if the doctors or nurses are telling you the recovery is a 1 or 2 year process, they're wrong. Your recovery will never stop as long as you keep trying and going better and better and better. You just can't think, this is me.
So
It
don't
does
give
not-
up
Don't give up.
until you
Yeah.
have exhausted everything you can do, right?
Yeah, my
That's
injury does
important.
not define me.
That's a wonderful.
And
Thing
find
to
a
share.
support group.
That's a good idea. And
A
the
local
Brain Injury
support group
Alliance.
and the Alliance. There's resources.
There are.
Don't think you're all alone, because you're not alone, but you need to find other survivors.
Because no one probably quite knows what it's like until they've experienced it, right?
That's
I mean,
true.
it's not
Yeah.
something you can define. Well, thank you both so much
Well, thank you,
for
Mary.
coming down. And I'm so sorry, time has gone so fast.
Well,
but,
thank you for the invites.
Well, we want to
Thank you.
hear from our next guest now, but perhaps sometime I can have you back and we'll do a second round
There
here
you go.
because it's
Yeah.
a lot to observe for us
It
as
is.
listeners too. The traumatic injury was really a hard one. best of luck to you as you keep
Thank you.
Thank
changing
you.
and growing and working on this.
Thanks.
I'll be back in just a minute with David King, who, as I mentioned before, is the Executive Director of the Minnesota Brain Injury Alliance. I am back, and I'm with David King now. David, as I mentioned a minute ago, is the Executive Director of the Brain Injury Alliance of Minnesota. So welcome,
Thanks.
David.
Great to be here.
I've learned so much, as I was telling you, from some conversations we've had and reading more on your website. There's so much to learn about head injuries and so many different ways we can have a head injury.
Yeah.
It kind of makes me walk around a little nervous all week. Was Ric's case kind of what you would maybe say a typical brain injury case with a long recovery and a real acute injury?
It's typical in a couple of ways. I think first because it was a fall, and falls is the #1 cause of brain injuries in this country. So it's typical in that way. But yeah, his recovery, I think, is very typical in that we see the consequences of brain injury sort of happen in 3 areas. There are cognitive consequences, there are emotional consequences, and physical consequences. And so when we talk about cognitive consequences, we're talking about things like memory loss, trouble concentrating, maybe a slower processing of information, all of which Ric referenced. With emotional consequences, anxiety and depression, maybe some impulse control or finding yourself getting angry more quickly are very typical.
Irritability.
Yes. And then physical are the things we hear probably the most about. And most of these are invisible. I mean, brain injury is referred to as the invisible injury, but chronic headaches and migraines, chronic fatigue, sensitivity to light and noise. There can be balance issues, loss of appetite, change in sleeping patterns, things like that. All of those are the physical consequences.
Now, not every head injury there results in all those tough results, correct?
Correct. Some of the ones that I mentioned are very typical, even with more of a mild or moderate concussion, especially when you talk about headaches, fatigue, those types of consequences are very typical. Sensitivity to light and noise is very typical.
Like with a migraine headache that often occurs.
And those can last for years.
Oh, interesting. So would you say those are the most common side effects isn't quite the right word, but
results of brain injury, yeah.
So headaches, fatigue, some memory issues.
Yeah. Sensitivity to light and noise is a very big one.
Too.
Dizziness, loss of balance, things like that.
What about depression as one of the emotional
So
changes?
yeah, depression and anxiety are very typical. And so we see that a lot. Part of it is especially in youth, but you're losing a part of your identity. And so especially when we talk about concussions with kids, you know, social is everything. And so you get a kid who's sidelined, and especially if they're an athlete and all of their social gatherings and connections are part of their teammates, and now they're no longer a part of that team. So a lot of times social isolation can set in, and that can lead to depression.
Yeah, I'm thinking too, just frustration must be a common side effect in a sense, because everything probably takes longer, at least at some points, to do.
And I think, yeah, frustration is a very common side effect. And I think that's sometimes where we see when we say that someone who is quicker to anger is a result of that frustration, that people get very tired of the length of time that it takes to get better. But I think Ric said it perfectly, that recovery can go on forever. And as long as you're willing to continue to work at it, you can continue to improve.
That was both exciting to hear and also kind of daunting to hear. I mean, some of each, right?
Right.
Ric's wife, Beth, sounded like I want her for a relative if I'm going through a crisis. But I'm guessing not everyone can handle things like this so well. And is there a higher rate of divorce? I know with a special needs child there is. And
right. There is a higher rate of divorce, I think, among families that have survived brain injury. And I think also just in relationships in general. I think we see not only marriages, but also friendships, in that oftentimes, you know, the loved one has a change. You're most often
Right.
not the same person that you were before
not
your injury.
quite.
And so people drift apart, people just don't understand you. And that's part of that piece of the invisibility of brain injury. You look the same as you did before your injury, and so people get very frustrated and confused as to why you're not acting the same. And so that causes frustration on both ends of the relationship.
Some of the things that can lead to this kind of injury, I mean, you've mentioned concussions, you've mentioned falls, car accidents, domestic violence. Talk about that for a minute.
So let me just first, if I can just sort of define brain injury. So a concussion is a brain injury, and a brain injury is really just any disruption or any impact or jolt that disrupts the normal function of the brain. So you can have a fall, never hit your head, but it's that whiplash effect. The brain floats in fluid within
hits
the skull,
doesn't it?
And so typically if you are falling backwards, the brain is going to hit the back of the skull first and then ricochet and hit the front.
Go forward,
so it's
sure.
called a coup contre coup. And so then anytime there is in sports, if there's a turning when you're doing that, then the brain is sort of in motion. And that's where you get the twisting and the shearing of the brain. The brain or the skull on the outside is very smooth. The skull on the inside is very jagged and rough.
It is.
And that's
I did not
where
know that.
and that's what causes the tear or the shearing of the brain and the bruising.
Oh, that's interesting. I often think the body is so beautifully put together, but in that case, not so good.
Right, and that's sort of the question with helmets. Helmets can help diffuse the power of that impact, but the brain is still going to move within that skull.
Sure.
And so, and again, you know, adults, the consistency of the brain is probably like Jell-O, but with children, it's the consistency of pudding. And so children's brains are actually damaged much more easily, but they also heal more easily.
Oh, interesting. I did not know that either. Just one yes or no with concussions, because we could do a whole show on sports concussions, but would you let your teenage child play football?
Yes.
You would. And you're saying because, I mean, this is part two of my question
all right.
here. I get to ask another one here. Because
I think that level of activity and what you can learn from, I mean, the benefits of physical activity and the benefits of being a part of a team and the skills that you can learn from that are very important. What I would do is remove my child from play at the first sign of a concussion, and I might not let them return to play after concussion. So I think, you know, there are a lot of doctors who say, you know, that they would always let their children play. You know, part of it is about the education and the awareness and knowing those signs and symptoms and making sure you're pulling that child out. Kids that get evaluated for concussions immediately have the fastest and the fullest recoveries. So part of it is now this arming families, students, coaches, referees with that knowledge and making sure that they are pulling themselves out or being pulled out of play and getting the adequate treatment that they need.
the Alliance, where you are the head, does so much educational work. I was impressed as I looked
Thank you.
at that. And I'm wondering, can you do preventative talks in the community as well as workshops for people who've sustained injuries and their families?
So yeah, we do both.
Okay,
so
good.
that, you know, as I said earlier, I mean, prevention for us is really about education, arming people with the information they need to protect themselves and also to seek the help they need once they've sustained an injury. But also for survivors, you know, we do a brain injury basics series where we're helping survivors and family members really understand once the rapid pace of the hospital and the rehabilitation, once they get home and really begin to realize those natural supports are disappearing and the loss that they have sustained as a result of that brain injury are really starting to show themselves. Maybe a husband and wife, a husband has had an injury and a wife is saying, I'm going back to work now and I'd like you to unload the dishwasher today. And then she gets back from work, the husband's watching TV and the dishwasher isn't unloaded. And really beginning to see some of the impacts of what is happening.
So, as we're saying, a long-term process. The services are free at the Alliance, which is fabulous. And you've got support groups, you've got the educational programs, you've got what's called case management. Just briefly tell us what that entails.
There are a series of waivers in our state for a variety of different disability groups. And so individuals who qualify for the waiver, and that's determined at the state and county level, will receive case management services. And what the case manager does is sort of literally just do that. They manage the case. They make sure that the individual is getting the variety of services or array of services that they need, and they help to manage the budget that that individual has been given to pay for those services.
So you're not relying on donations or grants because of this waiver?
Correct.
program
Fundraising is a
primarily?
very small piece of our budget. So providing contracted case management and a variety of other services is really what makes up the large bulk of our budget.
Would you like to give the website, just to be sure we get it just right?
Sure, it is braininjurymn.org.
The word alliance is
Nope.
not in there.
So just braininjurymn.org.
In the minute or so we have left, David, is there something that you think we Minnesotans need to know about brain injuries that we haven't touched on in our fast-wheeling 28 minutes here?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know that there is. I think just understanding the invisibility, because I think that's really the frustration that is felt by most survivors, is that they aren't understood, and when they talk about the symptoms that they're having and being questioned or maybe feeling judged because they're not obvious by seeing it, and therefore people begin to doubt the validity of the injury and the
And
assistance that
maybe say,
they're
are you
looking for.
feigning injury here?
Right.
Oh, I hadn't thought
And
of
so I
that.
think that's a big challenge for a lot of survivors that they feel they deal with, not only in the general public, but even within their families upon first receiving
Maybe
that injury.
especially with families
Yes.
sometimes. Well, that's important. Thank you so much for
Thank
coming
you so much for
down
having me.
and-
I've enjoyed
and,
it.
Helping us all learn more about this
Yes.
really big issue, and something to think and learn more about and get into prevention mode too.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for being with us. I'll be back again next week. Until then, have a good week.